Hello, AP Comparative. This is Andrew Canine broadcasting from Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare, and there's always room to see. Is that you, Mr. Larson?
I don't know if, is that Mr. Canine or is that Carmen Sandiego? I've been watching and looking for you around the world. You are the Magellan of our times, circumnavigating comparative government in ways no one ever anticipated. And in fact, can I just say, Phineas Fogg took 80 days. You've done it in 32 days, 33 days around the world. Fantastic. I cannot thank you enough for how much you've helped students and teachers prepare for a comparative government test, but also for a global citizenship. Fantastic.
Well, I know you love must-see TV, and this is season 1, episode 33, the season finale. So we wanted a room to see, wanted to see room to be. So welcome, Mr. Larson, broadcasting from Studio Room 2B, where there's always room to be a great citizen. And I heard it's an exciting weekend for your AP US Gov students.
Well, I'm learning from you, Mr. Canine, the importance of my cue cards. I would recommend for all students, either an American or comparative, to have those teleprompters ready to go when your test day arrives. For
Right.
American, of course, it's Monday, May 11th, comparative May 22nd. But I have right here, Mr. Canine, here's my grid. I've made my grid of all my countries. I've got Russia. I've kind of clumped them together, authoritarian versus more democratic. I'm labeling them with critical, distinguishing vocab, just as you've alerted us to, Andy. I'm ready to go. I wish our D-Day was a little bit sooner than the 22nd, but a few more days to enjoy the beach as we get ready for the big exam.
Well, we know a lot of our students at Stevenson High School, the north suburbs of Chicago, and a lot of the students out there watching and taking the AP comparative exam are seniors. We know that many are heading off to university. They probably wrote college application essays about their grittiness. So here's a time, I think it's a great tip, get gritty with it. Create those country grids. I think it's a terrific tip that goes along with some pre-writing tips we heard from Mrs. Bailey early this week.
Well, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I'm really encouraging all my students on their test day to show a lot of PDA. Now, relax, you're at home alone, but you need to proofread everything that you write, more so than any time that you've written for a teacher. In this particular instance, every word counts, and one misplaced word could make a big difference. So for the P, proofread. For the D, the big word I'm hearing from Mr. Canine is distinguishing vocab. There will be critical vocab in the quantitative and the argument, and you want to distinguish yourself. Let's not lower the bar. Let's not lower the standard. Let's find some of those fun words to really distinguish your writing. And then, Mr. Canine, the one piece that I'm a little bit worried about is the time. So I'm encouraging students to not only proofread and use distinguishing vocab, but to accelerate a little bit their writing. And you've been talking about ways to do that, not only preparing, but also preparing documents in advance that might accelerate the writing process. You're dead on, more PDA this year than any other that I can remember.
Well, it's so subtle of you to point out my mistake yesterday by pointing out that the P is proofread, because Mr. Larson knows I botched it yesterday. It was the first time I had to actually write to somebody else's question. All along, I've been answering questions that I've written. That's pretty easy for me to do, but yesterday we had samples from the College Board that we were reviewing, and I wrote a sample for the argument essay. And our chief reader yesterday was very polite. He got really quiet when I used my evidence from China. He got very quiet and polite. But Mr. Larson, thank you for the subtle reminder. I really screwed that up by not proofreading. But man, at Jack out there, a really, really observant student, quickly reached out to me at hashtag #APCompGov2020 with the, again, politely double checking, wait a minute, you used an evidence from China. I didn't see China on that list. It was Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia. And at Jack, no, I screwed it up and would have missed out on 3 points because I did not proofread. Now at Citizen U, Mr. Larson's website, we have, I'm going to bring this up.
Well, I'm getting jacked just hearing you talk about it. But when I talk proofreading, Mr. Kaneen, I'm not just talking about proofreading the big words. Think about the difference between saying or writing on your essay next week, the UK does not use coercion. The word not is the game changer there. It might be a slip. Take the word not out. The UK does use coercion. So this is the important part of proofreading. A simple 3 little not could make the difference between getting jacked and getting jacked.
Well, and I mentioned yesterday, and you actually taught, when I observed your class, how students can reuse vocabulary of the prompt in a very sophisticated way. Because yesterday, that argument essay that was the sample, the concept is sovereignty. And of course, my eyes and a student's eyes, with the accelerated time that you've talked about, they're going to go right to sovereignty.
That's right.
And really the critical piece is repeating that whole prompt vocab, maintaining sovereignty, because of how quickly to get whatever country you're using, you might start talking about losing sovereignty. Well, that's now completely opposite of what that prompt is asking you to argue about.
Well, on that note, I would remind students that anytime one of those big words is used, sovereignty, transparency, coercion, legitimacy, rule of law, don't jump into the argument before you've defined the term.
Okay, so let's go more tips in just a minute. I know you are geared up to go. Tell students about citizenu.org. You've been very helpful in posting to the Comparative Corner. There are some really alternative personalities here, but Comparative Corner is where they can go for their comparative resources and the FRQ samples, correct?
Yes, and just as a reminder, as my 8th grade econ teacher told me, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Well, there actually is, and that's citizenu.org. It's free. Everything you and I've made over the last 20 years essentially has been put on that website, not for just us and our edification, but to benefit students. And we've committed ourselves for a career to train political animals, which is what Aristotle called all of us, as we try to make sense of a crazy world that we live in political science, American and comparative. Boy, does it make a lot of sense now to be studying comparative government as we try to understand a way out of these escape rooms that we're all sitting in preparing for this test. And Citizen U just has a plethora of sources and helps, not unlike all the helps you've given us these last 33 days.
Right, thank you so much. And speaking of those helps, I had some advice from an AP student about how to find that AP ID, that advanced placement ID that they're calling the golden ticket. If you haven't gotten that email, don't panic, take initiative. Go to the myap.collegeboard.org, find that AP ID now. I've been showing these resources, go into that demo site. You can use that AP ID to help you navigate what it's gonna feel like on your first test day, whether it's Monday or whether it's May 22nd for comparative government. Review these videos are terrific resources. 5 steps before exam day, the exam walkthrough video. These are short, they're really graphic in terms of well organized. And so it's going to be super helpful to use these resources. So take a picture of this screen and go to those resources. Of course, our shout outs, always the shout outs at Jack. What a great catch on that argumentative essay. I know I have some students reaching out. They want me to read their argumentative essays. I promise you I will. It is that time of a season. And then Emmanuel pointed out a very nice, thoughtful note. And Mrs. Welch as well. Thank you very much for your nice note. And Chris G and Alex Dewey, Ben Rocks. I know you don't go to Stevenson High School, but I feel like Chris G and Alex Dewey, Ben Rocks are in our second period government class every day with how persistent they've been with helpful examples and curiosities. And of course, the one and only Mr. Dan Larson, creator of Citizen U. I heard you have an engagement tomorrow morning regarding AP US government?
Well, tomorrow, of course, is our Cram for the Exam show on C-SPAN. Put your DVR out there on Washington Journal at 7 a.m. Central Standard Time is the APUSH review, AP US History. And for our government students, 8 a.m. Central Standard Time. If that's too early for you and your dogs to get up, it'll be posted later on in the day. You can watch that hour of review anytime between now and the test. And frankly, I think you'll get a lot of tips, some helps, and reminders, and you just might hear a little tidbit that you hadn't thought about, and you're going to drop that in both your concept and your argument essay.
Absolutely. So for comparative government, our focus here for the rest of episode 33, again, go to the course description for comparative government. This is the first year it's been used. It's super helpful with concepts, vocabulary. It's amazing how many of those vocabulary are actually defined or given examples in the course description. Take a picture of this link if this is the first time tuning in. Go download this course description, use that for your preparation and have that readily available. Mr. Larson put our comparative resources at citizenu.org in the comparative corner, along with all of the FRQ sample answers I've used, including yesterday's corrected answer. You were talking about test tips before. The first question for both AP US government students and AP comparative government students is this argumentative essay. It's 7 points. We know it's 1 mega point for the thesis. We know the evidence paragraphs are each essentially 3 points. If you use correct country-specific evidence for comparative government, if you connect that evidence to your prompt, to your claim, and if you then explain really clearly why that evidence supports your claim, give us some, again, for those of you who don't know Mr. Larson, he's taught at Stevenson for 31 years. I want records from ETS. We think you've read more AP exams than any human being on the planet over the course of your 20 plus years of AP reading. I was trying to figure out, it's probably close to 47 to 50,000. What are your insights on student writing, particularly for this FRQ?
Well, I just want to remind the students that regardless of how much time I've spent reading AP exams, I'm not a Sherlock Holmes and I'm not even Watson. So don't hide mysteries into your claim or your arguments. Be as clear and explicit as possible. Don't make us guess. You're not writing a Stephen King novel for us. In fact, I wouldn't even worry about being sloppy with respect to personal pronouns. I'm okay in your claim with a I think. Not everyone agrees with me, but this isn't the time to have flowery language. I think this country supports my claim because. Describe the country, describe some of the details, and connect it to your claim. And then do it again. Use because, therefore, as many times as you can. In fact, even Dorothy on the way to Oz, I think, saying because. So there is precedent for using because as many times as possible.
And I know you've talked about the time and the acceleration time, and I think the proofreading is a terrific tip. We do think there will be time to add sentences to a thesis into the evidence on this.
Okay.
I think there'll be time.
No.
I'm going to parrot what Mr. Larson just said. I would use that thesis again in your evidence 1 and in your evidence 2. I would not be shy. Once you write that really solid thesis, I would not be shy about using it again and again, and make sure you have it, link it to that because, that causal statement that you heard the chief reader talking about yesterday. Again, this was the question, this is the sample question. Really interesting, develop an argument as to whether democratic or authoritarian regimes. We really have to highlight the idea that if you have a this or that choice, you got to pick this or that. Do not pick both. Don't pick something in between either. Pick a this or the that and make that part of your claim, and then read carefully. Notice China's not on that list. Don't use China. Use one or more of the following 4 countries. So you can use one country, you can use it twice if you have really good different examples from that one country. Most students are going to play it safe and they're going to talk about 2 different countries, but make sure that country's on the list. And as always, make sure you bring that core concept into your thesis, into your evidence 1, and into your evidence 2. Now, you were speaking to this earlier about vocabulary and concepts, and clearly there are 3 concepts a student's going to be talking about: either democratic or authoritarian, maintaining sovereignty, and legitimacy. What are your tips on writing about concepts?
Well, again, do not take for granted that the reader knows what you're talking about. I can't tell you how many times I've sat at a reading table and a reader says, "Do you think the student meant this?" Well, immediately the response is, we're not in the business of imagining what the student is trying to say. So be really explicit. Define what an authoritarian regime is. Define what sovereignty means. Define what legitimacy means. Then go about plugging those definitions into your argument. And it's going to take some time. But again, it's methodic, it's systematic, it's political science writing.
Absolutely.
Not a lot of bestsellers on that list.
So again, this was just case in point. I screwed it up. I wrote about China yesterday. China wasn't on the list. Didn't take me long, particularly with word processing, and you'll have access to, if you're typing this out, keyboarding it out, you'll be able, if you go back and proofread and realize you made a really big blunder, don't panic. You can go back in there, and it's because of technology, you can make big changes pretty quickly. And again, I posted that to citizenu.org in Comparative Corner. How about data, Mr. Larson? The second question is our data question called the Quantitative Analysis question. We think based on the sample, it's probably going to be an A, B, and a C, but we know students have to bring specific data into all 3 of those prompts. Even if it doesn't say use the data, bring specific data in. You're probably going to get points for bringing specific data in. Before I show you this question again, what general tips do you give the students about reading data?
Well, there's no one way to crack an egg, so forgive me if my egg cracking goes against yours, but we're still going to have the omelet when we're done. When I look at a quantitative analysis question, I read the A, B, and C before I look at the data. That's just me, because sometimes those data sets are like, oh my word, look at all those points, look at all those lines, look at all those numbers. I'm lost. I want to find focus first. So I go into my A, my B, and my C, particularly that A, because I know I'm going to need to use data points, not 1 point, but over time. I need to show and demonstrate my understanding of the data over time. But again, I'm using specific labeling from the quantitative chart, but I'm also using specific data. So I have to use the key words in the chart. I also have to use the key numbers. And again, you can't go wrong if you hold yourself to the data in the chart.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because if you were to go directly to the A, B, and the C, I mean, one of the things you're going to notice quickly is that the A, B, and the C all are about Iran, which helps simplify when you do go into the data. You got to find Iran, and that helps out. Then you also have to know Mexico, of course. But then particularly in the C, you see, well, even before you go into the data, the proportion of seats held by women, where am I ever going to find that? Oh my gosh, I go to the data, and don't go to the middle of the data. Don't go to the numbers. Go to the title. Yes. Go to your X and Y axis labels. What countries are listed? Oh, there's Iran. Literally, that comes from the proportion of seats held by women in the national legislature is from the title. Then you take a deep sigh of relief, because now you can go into, all right, now I need specific numbers that I can pull out of the center of the data and bring it in. But I think you're absolutely right. If you're writing about data and you're not using the title or the labels, the X and Y axis, in the footnote. The footnote, I showed an example a couple of days ago. The footnote can be so crucial, especially if it's an index score. And you're going to read that either in the title or the footnote. and then just use that word index score. You don't need to find synonyms. Use that exact language, write clearly so that the reader doesn't have to guess your answer.
One other tip on that, Mr. Canine, and you're right on, I'm getting jacked again here. Don't overthink the data. I've had students over the years that see a very subtle little blip at one point over the broad data set, and they want to think into it like, oh, I wonder if that was the year the hurricane hit. And it's like, you know, I don't think this is about that. Look at the whole data, make a big, broad generalization. Don't try to micromanage and find, oh, there's a little dip there in 2012, and I bet that was when the hurricane hit. Don't overdo it.
Right. And that's another great point, particularly when it asks for a pattern, or in this case, a trend or a difference. You have to talk about at least 2 different specific pieces of data to show a trend. Yes. Or a pattern, particularly if it's over a course of a number of years. You want to talk about over the course of a number of years. Do not isolate on one specific picture in time. You have to describe a trend, which is at least 2 pieces of data. I was just grading a bunch of these from my students this morning. I was shocked how many students talk generally about the data. They don't use numbers. I made a comment on a student's rubric. She wrote back and said, wait a minute, I thought if I spoke about the data without using numbers, that shows I'm more intelligent about the data. No. And because she was reading this as quantitative analysis, she thought the analysis meant that the student had to describe the data in a general way. And it's literally just the opposite. To get the point, the data points, in A, B, and C, you have to use specific data with specific labels to get those points. Do not write generally about this data. So, you know, into the logistics of uploading, downloading. I know you've gone through some of these documents. The students have reached out to you. Any general insights about the technology side of taking this exam digitally?
Well, there's no trick. There is no secret. When you take the AP test, you've got to be prepared. But again, I would prepare my little sheets here, my grids, my teleprompters. I'm ready to go. If it was me in 2020, if I want clear vision, I want to minimize the stress. And for me, that means I'm using my laptop. So I have a word processing document. Yeah. In the word processing document, I know they'll correct my spelling. I know they might even give me some grammatical encouragement and nudges, but more so than anything, I can have my documents prepared in advance with my ID numbers and AP College Board numbers. And I've already labeled my A and my B and my C for my quantitative. You know, I'm already starting to think about what my document looks like today, not May 22nd.
Just be wary if that autocorrect corrects your Russia into a China. That could be a problem, as I experience. Again, there's 3 different ways you can submit your work. You can download as a PDF or upload as a doc. You can copy and paste into the window and submit that straight from your Word document. Send it to the College Board. Make sure for all of these, your AP ID and your initials are at the top, particularly if you're handwriting, which you can absolutely do. Put that AP ID, your initials, and page numbers at the top. You got to take a picture vertically to submit it via your phone. But make sure you go in and practice and watch those videos and be prepared for that component. Now, Mr. Larson, we did invent a game years ago for AP US government. I think it's a much better game and more appropriate these days, particularly with this revised comparative government, for preparing students for the exam, for the idea of understanding concepts, but then knowing how they mix together, and then also connecting it to countries. I gotta tell you, I started thinking about argumentative essay ideas this morning, and you start taking about, if the argument essay asks for a choice, like that sample one we saw is democracy versus authoritarian, think about how many choices are presented in the course description of parliamentary versus presidential, federal, unitary. You could even mix in a devolution in there. You know, when you get to ideologies, neoliberalism versus socialism, rule of law, rule by law, these are all fair game concepts because this comparative exam does focus on units 1, 2, and 3. These are all concepts that are referenced in units 1, 2, and 3. And the nice thing is they're all concepts that are either a this or that. So I think you should know your this or that concepts. But I think it is game time. We're going to play a little check mix.
Well, can I just say, though, make a grid in advance. I find comparative, the biggest trick in comparative is just distinguishing between, okay, wait a minute, how's the legislature different in the UK compared to Nigeria? That's confusing to me, but if I have my grid using the terms as my guide, I want to know, okay, who's authoritarian? I want to know who's got greater media openness, who's civil societies, those types of things. But I'm putting them, labeling them in the context of my country grid. For me, I just think that's a game changer as I get ready for May 22nd.
Terrific, terrific. Do you want to play the game?
I'm in.
Do you have
Remind me how
cards?
it works.
Did you go buy some cards?
Yeah, but how does this work? Because I can see them over my head.
Well, I think if we go like this, I can't see what word is there. Can you see? But you can see it, right?
I lift it up a little bit. Okay, I see it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I can't see it. So if you were trying to get me to understand this word, how would you describe that word? And I'll see if I can guess it.
Unitary executive.
Unitary executive. Is that head of state?
Well,
No?
it could be. It could be.
Is it presidential?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Presidential, is it? Oh, wonderful.
Yes, it is. And what are the advantages of a presidential system?
Well, we know presidential, oh, wow, that's tricky. A presidential system, I guess compared to a parliamentary, allows for the possibility of more independence of the legislature to stand up and block actions of the president, because in a presidential system, the president's elected in a separate election from the legislature. So there's a natural separation. So you would see kind of a possibility of more natural checks and balances. You don't necessarily see that in Russia, which is a semi-presidential system, but that is certainly a possibility. All right.
Ready for a word?
Yeah. And you can't see this, right?
I'm not looking at it.
Okay. Oh, well, this is one of your favorite shows from childhood. I Dream of Ginny.
Oh, income inequality, of course. Income inequality. And of course, income inequality is one of my favorite comparative topics because it allows us to look at a number of critical concepts, not the least of which would be cleavages, in how all of the countries have various cleavages that differentiate different groups. You've got class cleavages in the UK, and you've got ethnic cleavages in China, for instance. And much of this means greater income inequality for some folks.
So we scripted this whole episode, this whole lesson out, but I did not script how to mix presidential system with income inequality. That was not on my teleprompter. So my mind is going through, how would you mix presidential system with income inequality? I don't think that would necessarily be a fair argument of essay, but if you go through this exercise, it's just a mental exercise of getting you in the mindset of mixing concepts. Perhaps I might say that in a presidential system, if you're trying to pass policies like increased taxes on the wealthy, in a presidential system, it's more difficult to pass those policies because the legislature, which is separate and more likely to be independent, is more likely to reject the president's policy proposals to find a way to reduce income inequality with higher taxes on the wealthy. Whereas in a parliamentary system, we know that that prime minister typically gets his or her way when it comes to the legislature approving the executive's proposals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But wouldn't you say that presidential systems are more likely to be authoritarian? And authoritarian governments would be more likely, perhaps.
You got to be careful here, because we know that in the world of comparative government with our 6 countries, we know that Mexico and Nigeria are the most authentic presidential systems, where we've actually seen party control alternate between different parties who've actually won presidential elections. We've actually seen in both Mexico and Nigeria democratization electorally, to the point where different parties have maintained majority control over the national legislature in these separate elections. So electorally, Mexico and Nigeria are considered to be more democratized than, let's say, than Russia. Again, Russia is a semi-presidential system because the president appoints a prime minister who's the head of government and in charge of the Duma. So in comparative, I would say Mexico and Nigeria are actually more likely to be democratic because of their presidential system and the possibilities of checks and balances.
Well, this is a question I have for you, because in both cases, Mexico and Nigeria, in their past, they've had charismatic single leaders who were called presidents. And could I use an argument that relates to Mexico and Nigeria over time, as opposed to maybe a trend? Maybe they're trending to be more democratic. Nigeria and Mexico historically, and I'm not talking 200 years, I'm talking 20 years, they've had very strong, charismatic individual leaders called president.
Well, that's where, early on in some of these lessons, I've used that Freedom House index scores, which is a really helpful way for students to look at countries on that democracy authoritarian spectrum. And we know the United Kingdom is the most fully democratic country of the 6 that we study in comparative government. We know China is the most authoritarian. Iran is really close. Russia certainly has been moving towards more authoritarian under Putin. And then you always have this question about Mexico and Nigeria, and where do you put those? And again, electorally, in terms of political rights, we know that both Mexico and Nigeria have allowed competition in their elections, which is a vital piece of democracy, that you have a competitive election, it's free and fair, and the other side has a chance to winning. We know that's happened in Mexico and Nigeria in the last 20 years, and repeatedly it's happened in Mexico. But if you saw that index score on journalist rights, or if you saw data from the treatment of journalists, it's not a pretty story in Mexico and Nigeria. And in some cases, it's criminal elements in Mexico that have made life very dangerous for journalists trying to hold government officials and the judicial system accountable. In some cases, it's religious factions in Nigeria that have made journalists' life very uncomfortable and violent. And in some cases, it's government of Mexico and Nigeria kind of responsible. So in terms of the treatment of some liberties, particularly the rights of journalists to do their jobs, Mexico and Nigeria, it's not a full democracy by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, in some cases, that the treatment of journalism and open media veers more towards authoritarian, and particularly in Nigeria. So do you want to play one more check mix?
Okay.
All right, I'm going to shuffle my cards.
Okay.
And all right, I cannot see. Can you see?
That's the same word. You're a terrible shuffler. I've seen this trick.
Now people know it's not rigged. They know it's not rigged. All right.
In your Vegas basement.
All right.
Okay. My clue for you on this word would be freely assembled organizations.
Oh, I'm a blessed person. Civil society.
One of your favorite words.
It is one of my favorite words. That would be on my comparative cake on test day. Civil society. Is that right? Wonderful. All right. Ready? And of course, civil society is a hallmark sign of democratization. If a government is more likely to allow independent groups of citizens to organize what we call the right to free assembly, that government is more likely to be what we call pluralist, right? They allow, it could be interest groups, it could be professional associations, it could just be independent sport leagues and recreational sport leagues. That's part of human beings coming together to communicate. When human beings communicate, they always complain. And if they complain about government, the hope is that they approach government and say, hey, government, can you do this to improve, which is democratization, even without holding elections, right? And if you look at Mexico and Nigeria, here's where they are much more likely to allow those independent associations of citizens to actually protect the right of free assembly, contrasted with how China and Iran and increasingly Russia make life very difficult for independent groups, particularly independent groups that are more critical of those authoritarian regimes in Iran and China and increasingly in Russia. So one more word from you. Yeah, let's see. I'll give you a clue. Oh my, stop. Now people think it's rigged. Disraeli. Giving you a British example. Disraeli, one of your favorite.
With words we govern. This must be the rule of law.
It is the rule of law. With words we govern. Prime Minister Disraeli, his famous quote describing a democracy with the rule of law. With words we govern.
Can you clarify this for me? You made a distinction in one of your previous sessions, might have been on your 17th sailing. The difference between rule of law and rule by law.
Yeah. I think, rule of law is democracy where laws matter, where laws apply to the powerful and the weak equally, right? And it's the idea that that if you have a rule of law system where the laws are passed in a transparent process, and we have an independent judiciary where judges aren't biased in favor of targeting only those opponents of the government or only those minority political parties, where everyone kind of feels like, oh, I could be prosecuted because I did this, or he's not going to be prosecuted because he's paying off the president and the president's allies. Well, that's a rule of law system where everyone's treated equally. What we see in authoritarian governments is rule by law, and that term is used in the course description. I mean, President Xi in China is doing this, it's and his allies. It's a really interesting example where they've cracked down on corruption enormously in China. Hundreds of thousands of government officials have been prosecuted for corrupt activities. So on the surface, it looks like rule of law because it's these government officials being held accountable, until you realize that all these government officials are coming from factions that were challenging President Xi and his allies for power in China's Communist Politburo. And then all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, President Xi's allies are still being allowed to get away with some of this corruption, while those rival factions are being prosecuted. Well, that's rule by law. It's the government or the regime using the law, using courts that are not independent to target political opponents, to keep that government, to keep that regime in power.
Well, my question to you is, in a comparative test, and I have to describe a country that has rule of law, can I use China? Or do I have to say, no, that's rule by law?
Aren't
all of our countries on this test technically ruled by law?
I would say that the course description is pretty clear that authoritarian governments are ruled by law systems.
But not rule of law.
Not rule of law. Not
Okay.
rule of law. Rule by law.
So that's a bit of a catch.
Well, no, because I think a legitimate question would be the independence of the courts. And we know that countries that are democracies like the United Kingdom, or moving towards democratization like Mexico and Nigeria on some metrics, those are countries that are more likely to have independent judicial systems where judges or Supreme Courts are more likely to say no to the executive, to say no to the government in power. That distinguishes rule of law and independence of courts. That doesn't happen in Russia, Dan. That doesn't happen in China and Iran. Those courts never even come close to holding the executive and the governments accountable, because those are more authoritarian governments ruled by law.
But as Putin is rearranging the power hierarchies to benefit himself, doesn't he need the Duma to agree?
Yeah, he needs the Duma and he needs the judges, and they always do agree. because there's no competition in Russia. That competition's gone in elections, which is why so many political scientists say that even though they have these civil liberty protections in the Russian constitution, really it's those groups that are opposed to United Russia and Putin's party find themselves on the difficult end of being prosecuted much more likely than Putin's allies do. And we know that even though there are national elections in Russia, they're held standard based on the Constitution, right? So on the surface, it looks like rule of law. We're holding all these elections on time as the Constitution dictates, but we know that those elections are rigged, and there are different ways that the government of Russia has used to manipulate the results of those elections so that United Russia and Putin's allies are never challenged for power, which is why so many political scientists have Russia in the authoritarian category. So
good distinction.
It has been great to be with you, Mr. Larson, and I'm looking forward to being with you tomorrow. We didn't mix civil society and rule of law. I kind of just did, I guess. In a rule of law system, those civil society groups are much more likely to associate and assemble and be able to criticize the government. And the rule of law courts, those independent courts, are much more likely to uphold the civil liberty protections, the right to free speech, the right to assembly, even of civil society groups that are criticizing the government. That's a mark of democratization. Authoritarian governments much more likely to crack down on those independent groups, especially if those groups are critical of the government. So, hey, those weren't fancy words. And I see you're not wearing a fancy suit. I appreciate this plain talk. I feel like it happened just in time.
Trying to make the complex simple and the confusing clear.
Well, I think you did a great job. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to Mr. Larson, our guest. And again, you can take a picture of these resources from College Board. Very helpful, particularly those short, tiny URLs and the walkthrough videos. You can go to Mr. Larson's website from the two teachers, citizenu.org, go to Comparative Corner. You can see all of his AP US Gov resources as well if you're prepping for that exam. And again, here's the pictures of the this or that concept mix. Prepare yourself, go through that course description, go through that glossary at CitizenU and the comparative materials, and make a grid. I love that. Get gritty with it. With your concepts and your countries. If you want to post your favorite mix of comparative concepts, use our hashtag at #APCompGov2020. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in. Mr. Larson was talking about this earlier with our students, that when you tell your grandkids what you went through.
Wait, May 22nd is a Friday.
Sorry, Friday, May 22nd. That's a mistake. Thank you for proofreading. Wow. Didn't need Jack for that. And you were telling our students earlier that this group, particularly our seniors, the class of 2020, they've been through so much. Their mothers were pregnant with them when 9/11 happened. They've been through so much. My son is the class of 2020. We have all the admiration for all the students who are fighting till the end here and showing their resolve and struggling through the adversity of these times. But particularly for that class of 2020, you've missed a lot of opportunities, but we really want to thank you. Thank you for those students who have reached out through social media. You've made me feel like I'm back in the classroom again. Thank you to our guests all this week, our great teachers, including Mr. Larson. You've made me feel like I'm back in the classroom again, and we can't wait to get back to the classroom, no matter whether it's in a physical class or Mr. Larson's virtual world. We want to thank you for tuning in. Mr. Larson, any final words for these students?
Well, it's appropriate it's 2020 because we need clear vision as we head not only into our AP tests next week, but also in our future. And frankly, as you've been preparing for these exams, you're also preparing for a lifelong fulfillment and flourishing as a global citizen. So hats off to you. Congratulations.
Hey, so thank you very much. Episode 33 is in the can. If you want to tune in to C-SPAN tomorrow morning, it is 9 a.m. Eastern time. You can get your AP US government teacher a shout out. You can get a call in. And thank you, Mr. Larson. And thank you, College Board, for making this possible. And thank you especially to all those students. We really want you to be well as we sign off from Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare, and there's always room to see how hard these students work. Thank you very much.